Already, while the previously explored battle at Sheppard Air Force Base in Wichita Falls was already underway, another battle was occurring concurrently, along with all of the rest of the battles unfolding along the border regions and deep in the land, conducted by the Trojan shock units of the PLA, Russian Army, and various other allies, all combined, were now unfolding. The fighting going on in the Lawton Fort Sill battle began with additional elements of the 77th PLA Group Army as a Trojan unit in the local area that weren't committed to the fighting just a bit to the south, and instead were committed to the fighting going on in the Fort Sill-Lawton area, which at this point in time were the 181st Combined Arms Brigade, the 77th Sustainment and Support Brigade, the 77th Artillery Brigade, 77th Chemical Defense Brigade, and 77th Combat Engineer Brigades, with the 77th Special Operations Brigade to arrive shortly by its own ground vehicles driven by its headquarters battalion, in addition to the 2 transport helicopter battalions flying the Z-20 utility helicopters, flying them into battle, starting later with flying them in to hold and secure the main airfield, the Henry Army Airfield, within the main post of Fort Sill itself, although this would initiate between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m., as well as being joined by the combat aviation assets of the 77th Aviation Bde as well, likewise joining the battle at that time, with an even later reinforcement to come up I-44 from the battle having had concluded at the Sheppard Air Force Base, Wichita Falls area, by both the 40th and 150th Mountain Combined Arms Brigades. At the initiation of the hostilities, for the same reasons as was apparent further south, the combat elements of the 77th PLA Group Army, the Trojan units, originating on CCP regime properties within this specific area, had taken their time in moving into the area to set up their artillery firing positions, especially as it related to the 77th Artillery Brigade of the 77th Group Army, as well as the 181st Combined Arms Brigade's 1 Artillery Battalion, consisting of PLZ 05 155mm howitzers, as well as waiting for the fixed-wing aviation assets of both the PLAAF and the Russian VVS to arrive in the area to begin their portion of the overall operations. These forces also awaited the firing of the container-disguised and based YJ-18C, Chinese-made container-based 4 cruise missile apiece systems, as well as the Russian Caliber or Klub-K-based container-based 4 missile-tubed disguised launching systems, to begin to fire their first volleys of their supersonic cruise missiles. Although these were not hypersonic, They were supersonic, as in they broke the sound barrier, but they were not subsonic, as they didn't fly at lower speeds than that. As these forces now began to arrive within the vicinity of both Fort Sill and the Lawton city limits, as well as in addition to the smaller town of Cache, Oklahoma, these forces had set out on many of their initial operations, with the highest priority having been given over to destroying the main air defense element currently on the installation, the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade, although there were other assets in place that needed to be dealt with. As facing these different combat assets of the 77th Group Army were even the units, as had been mentioned at the earlier Battle of El Paso along the border, that were sent to Fort Sill for training purposes before the invasion even had broken out, being the Divisional Artillery Brigade of the 1st Armored Division and its comprising battalions and headquarters battery. This, of course, being the 4th of the 27th, the 2nd of the 3rd, 4th of the 1st, 3rd of the 12th, all of which being artillery battalions, with the 4th of the 60th being a SHORAD element, or a short-range air defense element, as it was an air defense-oriented force. There was also the 15th Sustainment Brigade, also from training with the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade, as it had come along for the training. And then there was the home-based unit of the 75th Field Artillery Brigade, right here, and all of its subordinate battalions, 2 of which, the 3rd of the 13th and the 2nd of the 18th, being MLRS units operating the M270 systems, with the other 3 of its subordinate firing battalions being M109A6 Paladins, or 155mm howitzers that were self-propelled. There was also the 434th Field Artillery Brigade, which was a training brigade, again, much of it having had been deployed to the south as a force protection measure for the Air Force assets at the Sheppard Air Force Base, and were equipped with their M109A6 Paladins as a form of equipping them with heavy weapons befitted for their level of skills as artillerymen, ordinarily being the training cadre for the entire post, although there were skeleton crews left behind in order to train the cadets. There was also the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade, with its various Patriot battery-oriented systems. The 3rd of the 2nd, 4th of the 3rd, and 5th of the 5th Air Defense Artillery Regiments, or the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Air Defense Artillery Regiment, the 4th Battalion, 3rd Air Defense Artillery Regiment, and the 5th Battalion, 5th Air Defense Artillery Regiment, and the HHB, or Headquarters of Headquarters Battery, all comprising the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade itself. These forces were all beneath a great deal of Chinese surveillance and Russian surveillance in the form of both nations' satellites and also high-altitude drones such as the orbiting WZ-7 high-altitude reconnaissance drone and another orbiting CH-4A armed high-altitude reconnaissance drone. At the outset of the battle, the artillery forces at 40 minutes after 1 a.m. were now being notified that their PLAAF and Russian VVS, or Air Force, assets were now moving into the area from the south, as they were now flying through and past the Wichita Falls area, with a further of the full 8-bomber squadron, with 2 originally having been tasked with crippling the Sheppard Air Base. 1 was turned away as it was not deemed necessary, as the base literally rapidly fell in a manner of slightly over 30 minutes, being 35 minutes, and 1 was sent further north to aid in the combat unfolding on the installation. As again, at midnight, the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes had left the inhabitants in the installation completely in the dark as to what was going on, as much as was the case with the American civilian population as well. And often the danger was not fully understood or realized until it was far too late, and the first howitzers and rocket artillery systems began to open fire, along with the unmistakable roar of thousands upon thousands of small arms, including machine guns of different calibers and sizes, from heavy machine guns all the way down to general purpose, down to the light machine guns operated by the squads of PLA troops, along with their vehicles, who were now racing against their objectives. Although for the time being, just under half of the 77th Group Army was arrayed for battle against the installation, as the first priority of all was smashing the air installation just to the south at Sheppard for the 77th, they would soon rapidly be joined by reinforcements from their Group Army's Aviation Bde, its Special Operations Bde, and 2 additional combined arms brigades, being both mountain combined arms brigades in the form of the 40th and 150th, coming up the highway. Although by the time, again, that they would arrive, they wouldn't really be needed by that point, as by hour number 7, when they had begun to arrive in the vicinity, the battle by then would have been completely over with. The very first priority, again, was the SEAD operation, or suppression of enemy air defenses. And as this battle initiated at 1:40 a.m., literally only 20 minutes before the first volleys of the Klub-Ks and YJ-18Cs were timed to go off, and just as their PLAAF and Russian VVS assets in the form of their combat aircraft were arriving in the area, these forces would not have very long to wait until the aircraft and those cruise missiles would throw their additional firepower into the weight of the attack. The first moves of the battle were multifold across the entire area. The combat engineers smashed their way into the training areas on the eastern side of the installation, while also 2 mechanized infantry battalions of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade raced to seize control over the main local highway network in the form of the I-44 corridor through the city in order to secure that vital route for logistics and reinforcements from the rest of their group army, as well as to crush armed resistance and also to control the junction of the State Highway 62, which co-joined with I-44 just before the interstate cut up and through and out of the installation, passing through the installation itself. Securing this was, needless to say, highly vital. While that was occurring and happening, the other mechanized infantry battalion swung through the small town of Cache and broke through the installation on its western side, on its far west, while another mechanized infantry battalion and armored battalion smashed through a bit east from the farthest western breakthrough and joined together as they bolted to surround and annihilate the other elements of the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade while they were already taking artillery fire. At the time of this invasion, there had been ample training activities occurring throughout the installation. Of course, these were being undertaken by the 434th Field Artillery Brigade, not only training new recruits, but also conducting and coordinating joint training exercises with other forces from other units. Those being the 75th Field Artillery Brigade and the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Bde and 15th Sustainment Brigade. All of the aforementioned having nearly all of their units in the field, with very few remaining on the main installation at the time the invasion had erupted in full. As the 155 millimeter shells flew in and hit various air defense targets in the form of not only the 5th of the 5th Air Defense Artillery Battalion, the 4th of the 3rd, and the 3rd of the 2nd, and its HHB, or Headquarters of Headquarters Battery, but the 77th Artillery Brigade was firing its A300 systems many dozens of miles to the south and hitting targets on the Sheppard Air Force Base. Many of those targets were portions of the very skeleton crews remaining of the 434th Field Artillery Brigade, which, although these were battalion indicators, these were not their full battalions, as most of them were off to provide force security at the nearby airbase of Sheppard. The trainees and military police ordinarily posted on the base by this point were frantic, especially the trainees, as not only did they have little to no means to know what was even going on, but they had very little means with which to fight back. Although, to the credit of this being a TRADOC post, and that these trainees were always with their assigned personal rifles, at a future point in this battle, live ammunition would be distributed to them in great haste, as they wouldn't have to take the time to sign out their weaponry in order just to be able to use it in combat, as it would already be by their sides, as they were at this point in time out within training ranges and areas close to their local TRADOC billeting, where they normally stayed in terms of their training batteries and companies as it pertained to other MOSs besides the 13 Bravo or Field Artillery MOS, as other types of new recruits were trained here. Outside of the main post and in the eastern side of the installation, the 75th Field Artillery Brigade and the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade were conducting live fire training missions at the time of the invasion. And although their stockpile of shells at these live fire trainings were relatively small, they at least had signed out their weapons already to try to mimic a certain level of reality to the training. And therefore, fortunately for them, ammunition would be delivered to them in relatively short order, just as would be the case with the trainees. As the 181st Combined Arms Brigade Artillery was firing, and these battalions, the 2 mechanized infantry and 1 armored battalion, began to reach their objectives, being the units themselves, these different air defense artillery battalions and headquarters of headquarters battery of the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade. In addition to the artillery fire, it was now 20 minutes past 1:40 a.m., and the first cruise missiles were now beginning to fly in the form of the YJ-18C and Klub-K container-based cruise missiles, just as these units were arriving into their assault positions. In addition to this, there were some tactical ballistic missiles fired in the form of DF-15B tactical ballistic missiles, which had a slightly longer range than the DF-15Cs, which were being fired by the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade of both types, the B and C types, as also the DF-21As were being fired into this area as well, which likewise also had a longer range than the DF-15C, which was the bunker buster version of the DF-15, which was the one with the shortest range, which those could hit fortified targets at the Sheppard Air Force Base, the DF-15Cs, and were just within range for that, but could in fact not hit this deep inland, as Fort Sill was many miles further away in southwestern Oklahoma. And therefore, it was up to the DF-21As and DF-15Bs fired by the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade of the Eastern Theater Command of China to fire those specific models at the installation for the SEAD operations, which by this point in time, they had initially fired first at Sheppard, but now were reloading their TEL systems and firing a new volley of missiles at Fort Sill, which was timed to roughly coincide with the opening artillery salvos, the first cruise missile salvos, and the air assets in the form of the fixed-wing combat aircraft showing up into the area. Not to mention that the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade also had a slew of various other targets all throughout the land, and its subordinate battalions and their subordinate batteries would be firing at multiple different targets near simultaneously. The south central invasion sector of the entire invasion as a whole, which was nationwide, even alone, was such a target-rich environment, and the targets were so widely dispersed that it took intensive orchestration and coordination of efforts to be able to even conduct this type and level of an operation within the level and speed, just general rapidity of it overall, and was quite unfathomable, including even to those who were being attacked, as this was a vast nation, and truly to be able to conduct an operation on this order of magnitude, it would require a number of forces never before seen or put together anywhere in the world or at any time in history. Again, making even Operation Barbarossa look puny by comparison. And this battle in the Lawton and Fort Sill area as a whole was just one very tiny portion of the overall invasion occurring as a whole. As the tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and howitzer artillery now began to rain down, almost in a manner similar to the artillery doctrine as the time-on-target doctrine, where various artillery pieces were timed to all hit a relatively small area all at the same time, or specific target. This area was now being hit by not just artillery, but also being hit by cruise and ballistic missiles of the tactical ballistic missile varieties, and was now even being hit by tank shells from the 125 millimeter tank main guns of the Type 99A main battle tanks as they drove into the area and fired while on the move. By now, as they were reaching their main targets, they were less than a mile away and were hitting a vast array of vehicles, including a few Patriot missile launchers, and troops that were now running around frantically on the ground. As all of this was unfolding and these forces began to fan out to surround these air defense elements, the 3rd of the 2nd Air Defense Artillery Battalion completely abandoned its Patriot missile systems, with the troops fleeing to the east before heading south and then deciding to turn around and go back for their comrades of the other battalions. But by that time, they tried to pull a counterattack. Their counterattack fell upon the heavily armored vehicles of the 2 different battalions now operating in the area, with all of their subordinate companies having had successfully surrounded a large area of multiple square miles and were holding it as the cruise missiles flew in and the artillery flew in and decimated the air defense systems, which by this point, as the H-6K heavy strategic bombers flew in, 2 of these were equipped with the KG600 electronic jamming pods and were jamming the radars. So these Patriot systems were unable to be utilized in the amount of time that these bombers were actually airborne over the area, with the other bombers of the squadron not having as of yet had the upgrade installed, but this didn't really matter as they flew in a single formation, and these would linger in the area until the rest of the bombers had dropped their payloads before leaving to obtain more fuel and be reloaded for another combat operation. While this was going on, the air defense assets of the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade were easy pickings and were simply ripped apart by the combination of CH-901A loitering munitions fired by the headquarters battalion and its dedicated drone sections of the 181st Combined Arms Brigade, in addition to the now incoming groupings of YJ-18C and Klub-K caliber cruise missiles flying in from near distant areas wherein these different container missile systems had been placed, making their flight time to target exceedingly quick from their point that they were fired. As this was occurring and the surrounding forces now began to surround an enormous area wherein the headquarters of Headquarters Battery, portion of which was right here, and the 4th of the 3rd Patriot Battalion, which was scattered throughout the area, including off of the map slightly, they were beginning to be quickly ripped to shreds. In this area here, these are two fresh tactical ballistic missile hits from DF-21As and DF-15B up here. Here comes a 21A, a 15B, and these are caliber or YJ-18C supersonic ballistic missiles. I mean cruise missiles. And they're all flying in to decimate these different targets. Of the 4 Patriot batteries located in the area with the HHC, a few of these were slightly more widely distributed than were others, but one whole battery with its 6 launchers was right here. Another one right here. And then a third right here with a 4th just off the map and likewise being hit by howitzer artillery, and as these are the artillery markers for strikes at the time of the opening of the map. These are strikes. These are impending imminent strikes coming in mere seconds after the map opens up. These areas are being decimated by the combo of tank shells coming from the different tank companies, along with fire coming from the armored infantry companies from their VN-20 IFVs, which had anti-tank missile pods for the HJ-09 or 08s, and they had a 30mm autocannon. They had more armor than even the ZBD-04As had, and they had the laser and IR scrambling device, just like the Type 99A main battle tanks had. And they had their Type 89A infantry fighting vehicles with their turret gunners with heavy machine guns, such as a 12.7 millimeter. These troops are dismounting here from these IFVs, APCs. They're already dismounted. There were some observation posts, or OPs, set up by some of these air defense troops at the time as part of the training exercise when they came under fire. And this one's in a diamond formation here to watch all around it. This one's over here in a diamond formation to watch all around it, as is this one all the way over here. And this one's in a wedge formation. This one's moving down in a wedge formation. There's two MRAPs guarding the road here. As the artillery began to crash and blast all throughout this area at the very opening of the map, some of these vehicles hurriedly tried to speed off, such as this MRAP trying to go down the road only to be hit by a heat warhead-laden CH-901A, as well as this one here. This was just being an LMTV trying to drive down the road, getting hit by a heat warhead-equipped CH-901A. Before these cruise missiles even hit, this CH-901A hits this Patriot system right here. This one's destroyed by being on the edge of the blast radius of the 155 millimeter barrage opening up here. And over here you have some troops that they caught shrapnel on the very edge of the blast right here. These 5 are KIA'd. These 5 are these few up here are KIA'd. This guy's at a safe enough distance away, but he's catching a little bit of shrapnel, enough to where he's injured. This radar system right here goes to the command vehicle, which it's hooked to the command vehicle, which is over the batteries. So it's part of the whole system of batteries, and finds and tracks the targets for the batteries to fire at. But the radars are being jammed due to the KG600 jamming pods on the H-6K heavy strategic bombers when the 2 that were equipped with them out of the whole 8 of the squadron were flying over the area. So they were unable to fire at either the strategic bomber aircraft or the Russian Su-34 squadron that was in the area, or the Su-35 squadron, which was also in the area of the Russians, or the Chinese J-11 squadron, which was J-11 fighter jets, over the area to provide combat air patrols for air superiority operations to ensure that the skies were completely under their control in this specific area. All 4 of these combat squadrons were stationed to this specific area, with the bomber squadron covering both the Wichita Falls Sheppard Air Base airspace, as 2 of them originally broke off, with one being sent further north to the Fort Sill battle, which is this one moving later into the area behind all the others, as it was diverted away pretty quick after the battle was nearly fully completed at the air base, in order to help and assist with the combat occurring up here. And the Russian Su-35 squadron, the J-11 squadron, and the Su-34 squadron, which was a ground attack aircraft, the Su-34 strike aircraft, were specifically assigned to this area to support troops on the ground and for the J-11s to maintain air superiority just over this specific airspace. As this convoy of vehicles, these being a mix of international Max Pro MRAPs and 4 LMTVs, which were supposed to be conducting a sort of supply convoy for training purposes, were viciously attacked by the main battle tanks moving into position and firing down from this hill upon them, as well as others firing from further back. This is a wide area. This is a 3 mile by 4-mile map in total. This is a large area, 3 by 4 mile map. So they're firing at them from just over a mile away, except for right here when these moved up to get on top of the hill to fire down onto the road. They were approximately half a mile from them. And the CH-901As were coming in and attacking targets with onto the priority targets, and the MRAPs were 2 in the middle guarding these LMTVs on this side and on this side between the front and rear MRAP. These 2 MRAPs are hit by these heat warhead equipped or high explosive anti-tank warhead equipped CH-901As, while the artillery was coming in and decimating. This Patriot battery or system right here is being destroyed, like this one here on the edge of the blast. These LMTVs are destroyed. This missile's about to hit this radar site and also create a massive crater, in addition to all the 155 shells that are about to impact this whole area right here and decimate these tents that were set up to accommodate some of the troops of this particular battery right here, of 6 launchers and command vehicles, and their LMTV trucks, their fueler, their M88 recovery vehicle, and so on and so forth. All their battery vehicles that are right here are about to get impacted and destroyed by lots of 155 shells, in addition to the YJ-18C or Klub-K cruise missiles impacting here as well. This one going straight for the radar, and this one going straight for the radar, in addition to the artillery being fired, as this again is a suppression of enemy air defense operation, and due to the fact that America has no eyes and ears, as it's lost all its ISR assets in the form of satellites, and it's also drones, because the drone bases were some of the first places hit. Similar to the strike that occurred in the McAllen battle, I mean, they lost everything, and plus the electronic warfare being used against them all throughout the land. I mean, they had no way of seeing what was coming at them. So they were completely deaf, dumb, and blind, and by the time it came upon them, it was way too late. It all happened way too fast, and there was really almost no way to respond to it other than to abandon vehicles and flee the moment the first shells came in, like the 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Air Defense Artillery Regiment did, part of the 31st Overall Air Defense Artillery Brigade. They abandoned their equipment as it began to be destroyed by 155 shells and fled, and then tried to conduct a counterattack to try to relieve their cohorts of their comrades of their 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade, who were now surrounded by that point, and they had been completely destroyed while they conducted their counterattack against the cordon that had basically formed around this large area. And this was just one of the opening moves occurring as the battle was just initiating and just underway. At the exact same time as this particular smaller subsection of the larger battle was underway, the 77th Engineering Brigade, or Combat Engineers of the 77th PLA Group Army, were likewise striking deep into the installation and hitting the guest units that were training here in the form of the 1st Brigade, or I'm sorry, the 1st Division's Artillery Brigade, their divisional artillery, as well as the 15th Sustainment Brigade, also traveling with the 1st Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Brigade to conduct training, as well as the 75th Field Artillery Brigade. As that was happening, the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade here was the highest priority of all. But those other things were occurring concurrently to this as the first moves of the battle. So as the armor continued to move closer and closer and continued firing their 125 millimeter tank shells, while the artillery continued to splash and destroy everything, along with the missiles in the forms of DF-21As and DF-15Bs, Caliber and YJ-18C cruise missiles hitting everything, the area was left a charred landscape, like where these two tactical ballistic missiles landed along with artillery. As you can see, this is all blacked out earth from where the artillery hit in conjunction with these missile strikes. The headquarters battery over the entire brigade was sitting right here in this area here, just on and outside of the map, and it had set up tents for the original training mission that they were undertaking, only to be quickly targeted by artillery strikes and tactical ballistic missile strikes, as one had already hit. And at the very opening of this map, and these guys on the outermost edges were already KIA'd from being just within the blast radius of it. This guy just out a little further, badly wounded. All of these strikes were drone directed. And these troops here, who were retreating from the north, had set up an OP only to find that they were being surrounded, even on that side to the north, by other elements of the two battalions, one mechanized infantry and one armored, that had assaulted the area and completely surrounded it. Due to the failure of their communications equipment, due to the KG600 jamming pods of the two strategic bomber aircraft that had them equipped, their communications equipment was jammed as far as redundant systems were concerned. The radio was jammed, and so were the radars that went with these Patriot batteries. They opted to run back from their OPs, or their observation posts, to warn about what was happening, because they knew that if their communication equipment wasn't working, then nobody's was working, and they had to hightail it back to try to let everybody know what was going on. But by the time they arrived, since they were only on foot, it was far too late. They came back to smoldering campsites, cratered ruins, and completely charred earth from artillery strikes. And they too were hit in turn by the time they made it here. Coming back and seeing all these missiles flying in and artillery blasting huge chunks of earth out of the ground. I mean, they were running. They were booking it. By the time they got here, quadcopter reconnaissance drones and the high-flying WZ-7 in the area and CH-4A in the area had sent back their coordinates to the 181st Combined Arms Brigade's Artillery Battalion and its subordinate FDC sections of its various batteries, and they opened fire, passing the fire mission down to its gun lines, and they opened fire and wiped these two squads out. The armor finished these guys off with a fragmentation shell, or frag-T shell, just like the other tanks finished off this group of vehicles that was left after these two CH-901As hit these middle two MRAPs. And these dismounts down here, after their 30 millimeter autocannon of their IFV lit these MRAPs up and destroyed them, and also these troops in a wedge formation right here, these troops up on this hill, on this peak, at this observation post, this OP, they tried to fire down and at the dismounts and even the vehicles, firing an AT-4 down at this one. As yes, they had some of those handed out to mimic a real-life training environment. They were basically bounded and covered upon and fired up at by the gunner on the turret of this vehicle, on this Type 89A APC, which took some damage as the AT-4 splashed just in front of the left front track of the vehicle, nearly blasting the treads off had it hit a bit closer, but it took some minor shrapnel damage. The two squads here, bounded and covered, taking fire, small arms fire levied down upon them, and they simply outmaneuvered this squad here. While this squad was bounding, and this squad bounded, fired, this squad bounded, fired, this squad bounded again, fired, and then they went up from this side while this squad stayed moving straight ahead. And this squad took a KIA and a WIA, but this squad none, but they were being engaged. But they eventually outmaneuvered this squad, wiped them out, got to the top of the hill, and had full control over this hill. While the tanks fired a frag T-shell and wiped these guys out over here, so they had total control of this hill, and they were able to hold the high ground and look down into the area and observe all the damage that was occurring. Now it was their observation point. The other squads essentially were just moving in to do a BDA, battle damage assessment, while this squad did originally take a little bit of fire from the point man of this squad. They lit them up in conjunction with their infantry fighting vehicle right here, lighting up both MRAPs, in conjunction with the turret gunners with their heavy 12.7 millimeter machine guns firing roughly a mile, lighting these MRAPs up in conjunction with the 30 millimeter autocannon. Again, this is a large area. A lot of things going on this map. CH-901As hit this LMTV right here. And this MRAP was hit by some shrapnel from these artillery impacts, but also got hit by CH-901A all the way up here, coming down with its heat warhead equipped. And then, of course, this DF-15B kept coming down and impacted right in this area, totally wiping anything out that already wasn't wiped out by these couple cruise missiles flying in and artillery impacts. Again, it was like all different munitions were hitting the same area, saturating the same area, all at the same time. By 2:15 a.m., these different air defense artillery battalions comprising the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade, along with its headquarters of headquarters battery, were completely wiped out. This taking between 30 and 35 minutes, similar to the length of battle that occurred over the entire Sheppard Air Force Base. But the battle was not over, because even as these forces defeated the counterattack from what remained of this battalion here, who hadn't lost, I mean, they had lost all their vehicles, but they hadn't lost all their troops, and tried to carry out a counterattack to break into the encirclement and help get their comrades out. They defeated and destroyed that counterattack. The battle was not over yet, because as this battalion was destroyed by this mechanized infantry battalion coming up through Cache and into the installation from its far western end, it moved around to cut off escape from the northwestern end of the installation, while these two battalions, the armored and mechanized infantry, post. But again, concurrently with the fighting that was erupting here, other actions were occurring simultaneously all throughout the battlefield, including the combat engineers attacking the southwestern corner airfield here of the installation, along with the other battalions of the 77th Combat Engineer Brigade assaulting the forces that were training throughout different training areas and ranges of the 75th Field Artillery Brigade on the northeastern end of the main post and eastern end of the training ranges, as well as steady fire of artillery, and early on, before any of the fighting on the installation had formally initiated, I-44 and its junction with State Highway 62 were fully secured by two battalions of mechanized infantry from the 181st Combined Arms Brigade, who secured this vital route for the rest of their forces coming in from just to the south from the rest of the 77th Group Army at the Sheppard Air Base battle, which there, all in all, would be 3 full brigades of reinforcements entering the area, with 2 arriving too late for it to even matter, but being the 2 mountain combined arms brigades of the 40th and 150th, but the Special Operations Brigade of the 77th Group Army and its Aviation Bde would make a huge, huge impact on this battle. They had already defeated a tiny band of armed civilians that had risen up early on in the fighting due to all the noise and movement occurring nearby, as the 77th Artillery Brigade, one of its battalions, set up within city limits before firing. The other armed civilian bands soon to rise up in the hinterlands around the city and installation. Some would be crushed by conventional means, such as this battalion of support troops defeating with small arms this group, very small group of 180 armed civilians, while a new, nasty, lethal weapon, such as had been described in the intro video of this entire documentary series, would be tested at another encounter with hundreds of more armed civilians. That, of course, will be covered toward the end of this particular battle sub-series. In the next video, the fighting that erupted in the middle of the installation in its northeastern and inner eastern training areas. It's northeastern post proper and inner eastern training areas will be covered between elements of the 75th Field Artillery Brigade and elements of the 77th Combat Engineering Brigade of the 77th Group Army.